The dead stay silent, the living do not. In the funeral business, the hardest part isn't dealing with death. It's dealing with people who are still breathing. Because somehow, right when everyone should be quiet, a complaint shows up and makes you think, did they really just say that? This video isn't mocking the deceased. It's about human behavior, about the culture of the customer is always right, and about what happens when grief plus entitlement equals chaos. The tone stays observational, lightly sarcastic. No hard judgment because the truth is already funny enough. The stories you're about to hear are based on real complaints shared by people in the industry. Some details are anonymized. The behavior is real, and the level of absurdity very real. Each story is a different kind of complaint. No repeats, no made-up nonsense. So the real question is, do people lose their minds because of grief, or were they always like this to begin with? Story 1. Asking to exchange an urn, because it doesn't match the new curtains. About 3 weeks after the funeral, just when everyone assumed the chapter was closed, a woman walked back into the funeral home. Calm, casual, zero emotional buildup. She placed an urn on the counter gently, but with purpose. Like someone returning a shirt that didn't fit quite right. Inside the urn were her husband's ashes. She explained the problem wasn't the ceremony, wasn't the service, it was interior design. She had recently bought new living room curtains, light beige, very tasteful, and the urn too dark, completely off-tone. Didn't go with the room anymore. So she asked politely if she could exchange it for something more neutral, something easier on the eyes, for the overall aesthetic. When the staff explained that an urn already in use was not a returnable item, she looked genuinely surprised. To her at this point, the ashes weren't remains. They were decor. Bad decor. And bad decor obviously needs to be replaced. Story 2, weak Wi-Fi at a funeral cost a man his fantasy football bet. The service was solemn. Heads bowed, phones on silent. Everyone understood the assignment, except one guy. He sat in the back row, eyes glued to his phone, scrolling like his life depended on it. Swipe, refresh, swipe again. The problem? The chapel's Wi-Fi was terrible. A few days later, the funeral home received a very serious complaint. He explained that during the eulogy, the unstable internet connection prevented him from updating his fantasy football lineup. As a result, he lost that week's bet. And he lost money. Therefore, in his professional opinion, the funeral home should compensate him for substandard internet service. What stunned the staff wasn't the amount of money. It was the logic. Because apparently the real tragedy here wasn't saying goodbye to a human being. It was being offline for 20 minutes. Story 3. A family furious because the pallbearers weren't attractive enough. The procession went smoothly, right up until someone started looking a little too closely. Not at the casket, at the people carrying it. After the service, the funeral home received an extremely upset phone call. The family claimed the pallbearers were aesthetically unacceptable. Too old, hair too thin, faces that, quote, didn't photograph well. The issue apparently wasn't respect, wasn't dignity. It was the funeral photos. In the pictures, the pallbearers stood in the foreground, and the family felt this completely ruined the composition. They genuinely believed staff assignments should factor in appearance like casting for a photo shoot. At this point, the question was no longer who was being laid to rest. It was this a funeral? Or a dark-themed lookbook with a grief filter? Story 4, complaining because the deceased's outfit wasn't their style. On the morning of the service, the family discovered a serious problem. They forgot to bring clothes for the deceased. Panic followed. The funeral home stepped in calm, professional, efficient. They selected a clean, well-fitted suit. Neat, appropriate. Enough to save the day and let the service proceed without embarrassment. Everyone thought that was the end of it. It was not. After the funeral, a family member returned angry. The issue wasn't the ceremony. It wasn't respect. It was fashion taste. The suit was navy blue, and according to them, the deceased had worn only black his entire life. Choosing another color without asking was seen as a betrayal of personal style. There was no thank you for fixing the crisis, only frustration that the aesthetic had not been consulted. Because in some families, apparently fashion sense still outranks gratitude. Story 5. Asking for a cremation discount because the deceased was underweight. About a month after the cremation, the funeral home received a phone call that sounded very calculated. The man on the line wasn't crying, wasn't upset about the service. He got straight to the point. Could the cremation price be adjusted? His reasoning was simple. His wife, when she was alive, weighed less than 100 pounds. According to him, a flat rate was unfair. He compared funeral services to buying meat at the grocery store. Less weight, lower price. More weight, higher price. Perfectly logical. In his head, he even suggested pricing cremation by the pound. Like he was standing at a deli counter ordering sliced ham. The staff didn't freeze because of the money. They froze because of the logic. Because somehow a final goodbye had been turned into a cost-efficiency debate. In that moment, cremation wasn't a farewell anymore. It was a transaction that apparently still needed negotiating. Story 6. Asking the funeral procession to speed up because dinner reservations were coming up, the funeral procession moved slowly, deliberately, by the book. Everything was solemn right up until the driver's phone rang. On the other end was a family member, irritated, impatient. He was a few cars back and wanted to know why the line was moving so painfully slow. The explanation was refreshingly honest. He had dinner reservations, and if the procession kept going at this respectful memorial pace, he was going to miss appetizers. He asked the driver to speed things up. Cut through traffic. Maybe drive like an action movie just this once. The driver had to explain that this was a funeral procession, not food delivery. But to the caller, the issue wasn't saying goodbye. It was time management, balancing a relative's death against a table waiting to be seated. The climax here wasn't grief. It was logic so absurd it almost deserved its own moment of silence. Story 7. Refusing to pay because the funeral staff didn't cry enough. After the service, the family asked to speak with the manager. Serious faces, no small talk. They said there was an issue that simply could not be ignored. The funeral staff member was too calm. He stood straight, spoke gently, stayed professional. And most importantly, he didn't shed a single tear. To the family, this meant he was cold, detached. They expected the person in charge to be genuinely sad, maybe even cry, as proof that he cared. When staff explained that professionalism in funeral work means staying composed to support grieving families, they weren't convinced. They announced they would not pay in full because the emotional service did not meet expectations. Apparently, tears were no longer a human reaction. They were a deliverable, listed somewhere between flowers and seating. So now the question wasn't about dignity or care. It was this. Does a funeral home need professionalism or an Oscar-worthy performance to satisfy the customer? Story 8. Complaining about the visitation food like it was a buffet review. The visitation was quiet, respectful, until one guest started surveying the food table with a very professional gaze. Afterward, the funeral home received a feedback card longer than the eulogy. The writer criticized everything. The bread was too dry. The cold cuts lacked moisture. The coffee was below standard. Reading it, you'd swear this was a Yelp review for a weekend brunch. According to them, the disappointing food lowered the overall experience. They were expecting warmth, balance, comfort. Like dining with friends, except everyone was dressed in black and actively trying not to cry. The issue wasn't the food. It was the priority. While others came to say goodbye to a human being, someone was deeply focused on the hydration level of a slice of ham. At that moment, the funeral became a restaurant that failed to earn a Michelin star, and grief was quietly pushed to the side menu. Story 9. Blaming the chairs for being too comfortable and making an elderly guest fall asleep. The funeral home did everything to make the visitation comfortable. Padded chairs, soft lighting, a calm, quiet atmosphere. For one family, this was a problem. After the service, they sent in a complaint. The chairs were too comfortable, so comfortable that their elderly aunt fell asleep during the prayer. According to them, the overly pleasant environment encouraged disrespectful behavior. Their proposed solution made perfect sense to them. Next time, use harder chairs, preferably folding metal ones, so guests stay alert and properly feel the sadness. The funny part, no one at the service was bothered by the brief nap. Only the family was. Instead of accepting that age and fatigue are normal, they blamed the chairs for being too kind. A paradoxical complaint that makes you wonder, since when did comfort become a problem at a funeral? Story 10. Asking the funeral procession to stop at a drive-thru. The funeral procession moved slowly, lights on, cars spaced perfectly, everything by the book. Then the driver's phone rang. On the other end, a family member spoke plainly, "We're hungry." In his mind, the procession's right-of-way could be used for something more urgent, the nearest drive-thru. The request was oddly specific. Not a full meal, just a few hash browns. Enough to take the edge off. He genuinely believed that a line of cars led by a hearse followed by a priest and dozens of mourners queuing for fast food was perfectly reasonable. When the request was denied, he sounded deeply disappointed, as if compassion itself had failed him. To him, personal priorities shouldn't be interrupted by a farewell ritual. In that moment, hunger outranked solemnity, and the funeral almost became a breakfast pit stop. Story 11. Getting angry over the farewell song they personally chose. Before the service, the family sent the funeral home a very detailed music list. They were clear, very clear. Track number 3. Play it exactly at the closing moment. The staff followed instructions to the letter. At the most reflective point of the service, the song played, and the room instantly felt off. The melody was upbeat, a little too lively for a final goodbye. After the service, the family returned furious. They said the music ruined the mood and made the ceremony awkward. When reminded that they had chosen the song themselves, the narrative shifted immediately. No one took responsibility. Instead came the classic line, "You should have known this song wasn't appropriate." According to that logic, the funeral home's job wasn't just to follow instructions. It was to read minds and quietly correct the client's mistakes. The error wasn't picking the wrong song. It was failing to guess their thoughts better than they did. Story 12. Wanting to take flowers from another funeral because they had too many. While preparations were underway, a woman wandered into the room next door where a completely different funeral was taking place. She stopped in front of a beautiful flower arrangement, looked at it, paused for a moment, then decided to take it. When staff stepped in to stop her, she seemed genuinely confused. According to her, the other family had way too many flowers, while her service looked a bit empty. The logic sounded perfectly reasonable in her head. Flowers are flowers. The deceased are all deceased. Sharing a little doesn't hurt anyone. She even suggested the funeral home was being stingy for not allowing it. The issue wasn't the number of flowers. It was the boundary. In that moment, someone else's space of mourning was treated like a shared storage room. When grief turns into entitlement, basic courtesy and respect suddenly become concepts open for negotiation. Story 13. Being banned from taking a coffin selfie and calling it an attack on creativity. During the visitation, a young man climbed right up near the casket, held his phone as high as possible, and searched for the perfect angle. Before he could hit record, a funeral staff member calmly asked him to stop. What followed was not an apology. It was outrage. He explained this was grieving content for TikTok, a deeply personal form of expression. Being stopped, according to him, was an invasion of his creative freedom and embarrassing in front of his followers. His parents didn't side with the staff either. They complained that the funeral home didn't understand the younger generation. The clash wasn't really about the phone. It was about how different generations define privacy and respect. For one side, this was a moment for silence. For the other, if there's no video posted online, the grief somehow feels not real enough. Story 14. Complaining that the burial soil wasn't clean or pretty enough. The burial took place at the cemetery. Calm weather, no complications. Everything was going smoothly until the soil went in. One family member stared hard, frowned, and immediately took issue. The problem apparently was that the dirt was dirty. There were small rocks, some mud, and worst of all, it didn't look nice. They complained that the soil taken straight from the freshly dug grave failed to meet aesthetic standards. What they expected was fine, clean earth, even color. They even suggested bringing in premium soil from a gardening store, because to them, the final layer of dirt also needed to photograph well. In that moment, the cemetery turned into a landscaping project, and when aesthetics are pushed to that extreme, one small detail gets forgotten. Dirt is dirt, and beauty in this situation was never the point. Story 15. Demanding the room be warmer, even though the body needed to stay cool. In the visitation room, the temperature was kept low, necessary for the body and for the service to proceed safely. For one man in the front row, This was unacceptable. He stood up mid-service and demanded the heat be turned up. Why his feet were cold, staff explained very gently that the cooler temperature was required. He listened, nodded once, then delivered a line that froze the entire room. The dead don't feel anything. In his view, the comfort of the living clearly came first. At that point, the discussion wasn't technical anymore. It was about priorities. On one side, biological reality. On the other, a forgotten jacket left in the car. And in between, a farewell ceremony briefly transformed into a thermostat meeting. When personal comfort collides with non-negotiable reality, you realize something. Some comments are colder than the air conditioning itself. Story 16. Complaining that the procession was too serious and not emotional enough. The procession followed protocol. Quiet, slow, dignified. For one family, that wasn't enough. After the service, they complained that everything felt flat. Too even. No emotional peak, no moment. According to them, a farewell should make people feel something. They said it needed the right mood. Maybe louder music, more powerful words. At least one moment where someone visibly choked up. The silence in their eyes looked like a lack of effort. The way they described it, you'd think they weren't attending a funeral. They were reviewing a performance. In that moment, the question stopped being who was being laid to rest. It became, was this a person's final right or a show that failed to hit its emotional climax? Story 17. Using a digital scale to divide ashes and arguing over a few grams, 3 siblings walked into the funeral home carrying a digital kitchen scale, the kind you use for baking. They said they wanted to divide their mother's ashes with perfect fairness. No one objected until the numbers appeared. 2 portions matched. The third was heavier by a few grams. The atmosphere changed instantly. The youngest accused favoritism. The sister insisted she didn't take more. The argument escalated fast, from grams to old grievances to who mom loved more when she was alive. The funeral staff stood nearby helpless, watching a tiny scale become the centerpiece of a family tragedy. The bitterness wasn't in the ashes. It was in the way a few grams were enough to reopen old wounds. In that moment, loss was reduced to a number, and family bonds were weighed right alongside the remains. Story 18. Getting angry because there was no valet for mourners. The visitation was crowded. The parking lot was full. One guest had to park brace yourself about 50 meters from the entrance. After the service, the funeral home received a formal complaint. The issue was very clear. The walking distance was excessive and inappropriate for a suit. The guest explained he had walked for almost 2 minutes, broke a light sweat, and as a result, his suit no longer looked perfect. He demanded compensation for dry cleaning costs because the experience did not meet standards. In his view, an event this important should have valet parking or at least a level of reception worthy of the occasion. The way he described it, you'd think he attended a movie premiere. In that moment, the funeral was compared to a Hollywood red carpet, and walking a few dozen steps became a personal insult. Apparently, for some people, minor inconvenience is far more offensive than the reality of the moment. Story 19. Complaining that the hearse was too gloomy and demanding happier colors. After the service, a widow called the funeral home with what she described as constructive feedback. She said the black hearse looked far too gloomy and didn't match the idea of a celebration of life. According to her, her husband had been a cheerful man, so his final ride should feel brighter too. She offered very specific suggestions, yellow, green, or any color that looked like a sunny day. When staff explained that black is traditional, a symbol of dignity and respect, she wasn't impressed. To her, tradition was just an outdated habit lacking creativity. This complaint didn't come from grief. It came from a misunderstanding of what celebration of life means. In that moment, the hearse stopped being a symbol of farewell and became a personal accessory meant to match aesthetic taste, and the line between remembrance and decoration quietly blurred. Story 20. Wanting to delay the burial to catch a store-wide sale. On the morning of the burial, everything was set. The priest, the burial team, a schedule locked down to the minute. Then the phone rang. A family member asked for a small adjustment to the burial time. The reason was surprisingly practical. A nearby furniture store was running a limited time sale, and they didn't want to miss the chance to buy their dream sofa. In their view, pushing the burial back a few hours was no big deal. The grave would still be there, and the deceased was already settled. When staff explained that the timing involved multiple parties and couldn't be changed on a whim, they sounded genuinely disappointed, like a once-in-a-lifetime deal had just slipped away. This wasn't a clash between life and death. It was a collision between discounts and sacred ritual. In that moment, personal priorities barged in, and the farewell nearly took a back seat to a big red sign reading 50% off. So, story 21, demanding a refund because rain ruined leather shoes. The burial was held outdoors when a light rain started to fall. The funeral home did what it could. Tents were set up, carpets laid down, every reasonable precaution taken. The next day the phone rang. The request was very specific, a refund. The reason: the rain turned the grass into mud and dirtied the son's Italian leather shoes. His argument was simple. The service failed to control the weather, which caused damage to personal property. According to him, the funeral home should have checked the radar better or rescheduled the burial entirely to guarantee sunshine. Because leather shoes don't do rain. He even suggested a partial refund to cover cleaning and polishing costs. The irony wasn't about the shoes. It was about responsibility. When weather becomes a service failure, grief gets pushed aside, making room for a maintenance bill. In that moment, the rain didn't fall from the sky. It fell straight out of the complaint form. Story 22, disappointed because the limousine was too quiet. On the way from the funeral home to the cemetery, the family rode together in a limousine. The space was quiet, calm, appropriately solemn. For a few people inside the car, this was a serious flaw. After the service, they complained that the ride was boring. No music, no drinks. The driver even refused to turn on the radio. According to them, a 20-minute ride should have had more atmosphere to help everyone relax. The way they described it, you'd think this was an after-party, not a final farewell. In their minds, a limousine equals entertainment regardless of the destination. The disappointment didn't come from grief. It came from misplaced expectations. When a funeral car gets reviewed like a party bus, the line between remembrance and entertainment quietly disappears. Story 23. Getting angry because the doves flew away too fast. At the end of the service, the family paid for a white dove release, a symbolic, beautiful moment. The cage opened. The birds shot into the sky, doing exactly what birds have always done. The family's reaction: anger. The doves flew away too fast. According to them, the bird should have hovered at eye level for a few minutes so everyone could get photos. Some even asked why the doves didn't circle back or stay still for the shot. The entire complaint revolved around one thing: there wasn't enough time to post the perfect picture online. The problem wasn't the birds. It was the expectation. When nature is expected to follow a script and remembrance is measured in likes, the doves become extras who miss their cues. In this story, the fastest thing that flew away wasn't the birds. It was the line between ritual and image. Story 24, demanding better livestream lighting and a beauty filter. Because some relatives couldn't attend in person, the funeral was live-streamed. Everything went smoothly until the funeral home's phone rang right in the middle of the service. On the other end was a sister watching on Zoom. Upset. She complained that the lighting was unflattering. It made her sister, who was crying, look tired and washed out. She demanded adjustments, change the camera angle, turn up the lights, and ideally add a light beauty filter to make things more watchable. After all, people were watching. In that moment, grief sat right next to vanity. The funeral suddenly felt like a video shoot that hadn't been lit properly. When modern media slips into farewell rituals, sadness stops being just an emotion. It becomes an image that needs editing before going live. Story 25. Demanding staff remove the secret mistress from the funeral. In the middle of the visitation, a widow walked straight up to the front desk. Her face was ice cold. She pointed toward the back of the room, where a woman sat quietly crying, and said very simply, "Please remove her." The reason wasn't noise, wasn't disruption. It was because that woman was her husband's secret mistress. The funeral staff froze. They were hired to run a service, not investigate private lives. But the widow insisted this was a service responsibility. According to her, staff should know who is allowed to grieve where and who isn't. For a few tense minutes, a family secret unfolded in full view of everyone. The funeral turned into an unscripted TV drama, and the funeral home very unwillingly was handed a brand new role handling personal scandals with zero script and absolutely no hazard pay. Story 26. Wanting to swap cremation jewelry because it didn't match a new watch. About a week after receiving a necklace containing ashes, a woman returned to the funeral home decisive focused. She wasn't complaining about craftsmanship or quality. The problem was color. The silver necklace no longer matched her newly purchased gold watch. She asked if it could be exchanged for a version that was easier to style, like swapping accessories at a fashion store. When staff explained that cremation jewelry is permanently sealed and cannot be altered, she grew irritated. According to her, the funeral home was holding her father hostage inside an accessory that didn't fit her aesthetic. The peak of the story wasn't the necklace. It was the erased boundary. In that moment, the deceased was compared to an item that needed to match an outfit. And the question lingered, when memories are packaged as accessories, are we honoring the dead or just accessorizing our grief? Story 27, complaining that the podium didn't have a teleprompter. Before delivering the eulogy, a man stepped up to the podium with the confidence of a seasoned speaker. He asked very seriously where the teleprompter was. When told the funeral home only provided a microphone and a wooden lectern, he froze, like he'd just been downgraded. After the service, a complaint appeared. He claimed the lack of a teleprompter made him look unprepared in front of relatives. According to him, the funeral home should have uploaded the speech he emailed and scrolled it smoothly like a presidential address. Rather than accept that he could have printed notes or practiced beforehand, he blamed technology. In this story, the problem wasn't the pain of saying goodbye. It was not being supported like he was addressing the nation. Apparently, for some people, a eulogy podium should function like a miniature White House. Story 28, complaining that the artificial grass was the wrong seasonal shade of green. The cemetery used artificial grass to cover the freshly filled soil. A common solution, clean, practical. For one family member, this was unacceptable. He stared at the patch of grass and complained that the green was too neon. It didn't match the real grass nearby, not for this season. According to him, each season deserves its own specific shade of green. Spring green, summer green, fall leaning green. And clearly, the funeral home should have prepared multiple artificial grass options to match lighting conditions and photo aesthetics. He delivered this critique with the seriousness of a landscape designer. At this point, aesthetic obsession had completely outrun the moment. While others stood there saying goodbye, he was mentally adjusting an imaginary color palette. When details are scrutinized this hard, a grave stops being a resting place and turns into a failed decor project. And grief gets drowned out by one important question. Is this green seasonally correct? Story 29, getting angry because their family name wasn't bigger than the one next door. Outside the funeral home, an electronic board displayed the names of families holding services that day. Same font, same size, clean and orderly. For most people, it was just information. For one man, it was a matter of honor. He complained that his family's name was not printed larger than the family next to them. According to him, his family had higher standing in the community, and the sign should reflect that. Seeing two names in the same font size was, in his view, disrespectful. He requested bigger letters, bold text, maybe even a more prominent position. In that moment, the funeral stopped being a farewell. It became a quiet status comparison. Instead of remembering the dead together, the name board turned into a ranking system. And death, ironically, became the stage for a competition where no one could possibly win. Story 30, demanding the entire highway be shut down for the funeral procession. The funeral procession received police assistance through intersections. Everything followed the law. For one son, this still wasn't enough. He was furious that traffic in the opposite lanes on the highway kept moving. According to him, respect meant the entire road should come to a stop. He called to complain that the funeral home should have requested a full highway closure so the procession could travel with proper dignity without anyone passing them. The fact that other drivers continued moving at legal speed felt like a personal insult. Here, right-of-way was mistaken for absolute power. The procession was suddenly expected to function like a head-of-state convoy. In that moment, grief turned into an illusion of authority, and traffic laws became something to pause for personal feelings. Story 31, demanding a refund because he was still sad after the funeral. 2 weeks after the service, the funeral home received a very serious phone call. The man on the line wasn't complaining about the ceremony, the sound system, the flowers. He said just one thing. He was still sad. According to him, the purpose of a funeral is to provide closure. And since that feeling had not arrived yet, the service was clearly unfinished. He compared the funeral to car repair. If the car still makes noise, the mechanic is responsible. If the grief remains, the funeral home should issue a refund. The logic was delivered so cleanly, it was almost frightening. The climax here wasn't the refund request. It was the way pain was packaged like a product. When funerals are judged by immediate results, a larger question appears. Did we come to remember a person or to purchase a grief cure with a warranty? These 31 stories aren't really about death. They're about how people react when they're standing right in front of it. Grief itself isn't a bad thing. It's human. It's natural. But when grief shows up hand in hand with entitlement, things start to bend sideways. And suddenly, a funeral stops being a farewell and turns into a service experience that people feel entitled to rate. Some demand refunds. Some demand color changes. Some demand emotional climaxes. It sounds absurd, but all of it points to the same truth. We don't always know how to behave in the face of loss. Now it's your turn. Out of these 31 stories, which one did you find the hardest to believe? Have you ever witnessed something like this yourself? Drop a comment, share this with someone who always says, yeah, right, that has to be fake. And if you enjoy real stories told slowly without judgment, don't forget to subscribe.